So thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. And I would like to express my deep regret for not being able to be with you today. I'm speaking from France, Paris. So hopefully you can hear me well, and we can try to have a conversation even from far away. So just to give you a bit of context, I did my historical research, as you were saying, about the history of Arab immigration to Canada from the 19th century until the 1980s around the Arab identification and political mobilization. I will mainly talk about that today, even though later on I did other field studies with more contemporary and sociological perspective on Islamophobia and the Muslim experience in Canada. So the confusion made between Arabs and Muslims is one of the dimensions of the racism they experience. But there is also a continuity between historical Orientalism and Islamophobia today, as Khalid was saying just before. So I think this historical perspective I will try to give today will be kind of interesting and will be complementary with the other talks we heard. So it is important to have in mind this perspective in order to understand what happened after 9/11 and to navigate between different scales of analysis, the international dimension and the local one, to explain this continuity. In this presentation, I will focus on the Arab mobilization in Canada for the Palestinian cause to show how it evolved and how it was so sensitive for the Canadian government. I will analyze how the Canadian state viewed the Arab activists and the surveillance that resulted from it. I will finally show how the racial and political profiling of this population after 9/11 is related to this history. So I will start with the question of the history of the Arab mobilization in Canada and the political position of the state. So at the beginning of the 20th century, Arab activists in Canada primarily organized to reject the discriminatory immigration laws, asking to be excluded from the Asian category. This was a very interesting campaign showing how the immigrants from the Middle East were viewed by the Canadian state and their position in the racial Canadian hierarchy at the time. So as everybody knows, Orientalist stereotypes were very strong at this time. But these populations were not the most targeted ones. Like in this Canadian racial hierarchy, the other Asian actually were more considered as a threat and were a target of a very strong racist movements in Canada at the beginning of the century. But as we're going to see after 1945 and mostly the 1960s and 70s, and of course until today, the situation will change when the organization of the Arab minority started being more political on issues such as the Palestinian transnational cause. At the time and until today, actually, the organizations favorable to the creation of the Jewish state in Palestine were much stronger than the Arab voices against this colonial project. And the Zionist groups were able to make political authorities aware of their cause because their demands were in accordance with Canada's desire to play a role on the international scene by taking up a position in relation to Great Britain and the United States, and by making Canada's voice heard at the heart of the UN. From that day on, Arab demands for defending Palestinian rights and other political issues actually related to the region of origin were seen with suspicion and surveyed by the Canadian government. Reading the archives of the Department of External Affairs, it reveals that advocacy of Arab nationalism and attacks on Israel were seen not only as propaganda, but also as extremist views. The perception of Arab representatives shows how Orientalist stereotypes delegitimize their claims for Palestine, which were never discussed in substance. So archives shows that Canada hoped to preserve an image of equilibrium in the region, maintaining a privileged friendship with Israel, and at the same time promoting stability and peace in the Middle East. But as soon as these stakes were threatened, when Arab activists were trying to say, well, that's not true, there is a real bias in favor of the Israeli government, at each period, the government became closely interested in surveilling Arab activists. And we can see, and I'm going to shift to my second part about the 1960s and 70s, where there is a turning point in this situation where it's going to become even less favorable as suspicion of terrorism bore down on them. So after 1967, the situation became much more critical on like an international scene, as everybody knows. And in addition to Canada's position against Arab nationalist demand, the links of Arab associations with other political movements in Canada, such as the Québécois nationalist movement at the time, that was really not looked upon kindly by the Canadian government, but also other groups such as the indigenous struggles, Black activists, communists. All those groups were kind of linked or supported by some of the Arab organization at the time. And all those links were making all of them more and more suspicious also. So Canada considered, for example, to get back to the Arab question, the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, as a terrorist group, and it continued to consider PLO as terrorist a lot longer than when the UN and other countries decided that it was a legitimate organization to represent Palestinian people. But Canada continued considering PLO as a terrorist organization. So everybody who was voicing something for the Palestinian cause was considered as allying or supporting a terrorist organization. And all the Arab groups at this time were complaining of being watched and surveilled and even infiltrated sometimes. And all of this will eventually be confirmed by a commission called the MacDonald Commission, which is a big inquiry and report on the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police actions in the 60s and the 70s. And in 1981, this MacDonald Commission proved that these Arab groups were right, and other groups who were complaining from being surveilled, of course. But there was a little part on the Arab activists, which proved that the Canadian government was surveilling them systematically when they were expressing anything related to an Arab nationalist cause. And they were suspected of terrorism, and this is what the commission says. And there was an intensification in the surveillance of hundreds of activists, even though there was never, ever any case where they were really condemned or something that was really tangible. And also the links with the PLO were not tangible at the time either. So the security services interpretation of who was extremist at the time and suspected of terrorism corresponded to Canada's political position regarding the Middle East, but also the racial stereotypes related to the Arab origins of these activists. And this is where we have this very interesting continuity and link between the Orientalism historically, the period of the 60s and the 70s, and what we are seeing as the contemporary Islamophobia today, and the suspicion on Muslims more broadly. So this gets me to my last part. So the position of Arabs in the racial hierarchy at the beginning of the 20th century, marked by Oriental prejudices as described by Edouard Said, and as I was saying too, will be mixed with foreign policy imperatives more recently. So these imperialist positions were themselves linked to more negative stereotypes as the decolonization of this region and the Arab-Israeli conflict developed. So several events that have taken place even after 1980s will show that the surveillance and suspicion will continue. And of course, the region, the Middle East, the broad Middle East, let's say, will become even a more target and a central target for the Canadian government, as for the US, of course, when there was this imperialist project after the fall of the USSR, of course. So during the first Gulf War already, and then the second, and the invasion of Afghanistan and other, but already during the first Gulf War, we had very similar accusation from the activist Arab organizations saying that the intelligence services were visiting them, surveilling the demonstration they were having for Palestine or against the war in Iraq. And this surveillance will also give rise to the use of undercover agents, even provocateur, always linked in one way or another to the Arab Muslim region. So for example, in 1998, so before 9/11, and often we forget that before 9/11, there was already many things happening against Muslims in general, or all this like blurry region of the Middle East. So there was the case of Joseph Gilles Briot that made himself called Youssef Muammar. who threatened to carry out a terrorist attack with a biochemical weapon in the Montreal metro, which was a big case. And a little bit after that, we discovered that this person was an undercover agent. So before and after September 11, 2001, the construction of a Muslim threat in the West justifies surveillance of minorities from the Arab region and more broadly. Today, the figure of the Palestinian terrorist of the 1970s, as I was describing, resonates with the more recent image of the Muslim terrorist. And I think there is a direct continuity and link between the two. So now we have this racial criterion that will be intertwined with the criterion of religious affiliation. And I think both are always related. And also the political dimension of this, the surveillance and the profiling will not disappear, of course. So we always have those three together. So the images of the Arab and the Muslim merge, and all these groups are targeted because of their political opinion. So opponent of the invasion of Iraq, as I was saying, or Afghanistan, supposed followers of a so-called radical political Islam, and also activists of the Palestinian cause, as I was saying. This is how we shifted from a vocabulary of extremists that we still use, of course, to radicalization that will become like the main accusation. So national security and the naming of an interior enemy allows those in power to define protests as criminal acts, denying all legitimacy to the cause in question and to the activists themselves. And as quoted in one of the last books edited by Aziz Choudhry, who left us recently and to whom I wish to pay tribute here, and I quote, "The war on terror provides a convenient frame, lens, and set of justification through which states can view a range of dissenting ideas and activities, as well as target the latest suspect communities." So the war on terror, as we all know, resulted in torture, death, war, etc., where we see the consequences of political racial profiling, which has also targeted Canadian citizens from Maher Arar to Amir Kader, not to mention Muslim foreign nationals with security certificates accused of terrorism. And all these testimonies were collected by an initiative called the People's Commission Network in Montreal in 2006. And it was a really interesting way to bring these testimonies around all the surveillance of Muslims. So I'm going to conclude now. So to quote Aziz Choudhry again, in Canada, we must always recall that we are in a settler colonial society, as everybody says today, of course, where, I quote, "imperialism and colonialism have long been at the heart of present-day security states and their security apparatus. In many cases, often overlapping lineages of overseas experiences of counterinsurgency against anti-colonial movements, and closer at hand, the policing of indigenous peoples and Black communities." And it's exactly what I was trying to show during this presentation, that is part of this broader history of colonialism, immigration, racism, and international relations in Canada. And I think it's always important to get back to also all this power dynamics that we have between states, and that explains then also the local dynamics that we have in a country. And it is interesting to see the continuity of racism and profiling, which materializes against advocates of anti-colonial and anti-racist causes related to the region of origin of immigrants and the internal situation in Canada. And that's why I took the example of the Palestinian cause that seems to me as very representative of this dynamic, as is the construction of a Muslim enemy before and after 9/11. Thank you very much.
Okay, all right. So thank you so much, Professor Houda, for your remarks. Thanks to each of the panelists. Now we're going to open it up to questions. And if I may, I'm going to kick it off and then go back. So I'm going to start with a bit of a facetious question. Can Netflix fix this? And I ask it more so just thinking about what each of you have kind of talked about, and that is sort of the various Orientalist tropes, the various stereotypes, the various ways that Muslims, Arabs, people from the region have been constructed in the popular imagination. And so I was watching the first episode of Rami, season 3 this morning, and Pressure Cooker I've been listening to as well, Professor Faisal, and of course Mo, about the experiences of a Palestinian American, which is on Netflix too. And I'm just wondering, you know, you're all obviously very steeped in the academia, but when we think about the impacts of popular culture on the way that these identities and intersectional vision of what it means to be a Muslim, for instance, can I ask each of you just to reflect a little bit on whether things can actually improve if we start to see that diversity of experiences actually reflected back at us, as well as to others who are watching and consuming this type of media. So maybe I'll start it with Professor Houda and then bring it to Professor Khalid and then back to Professor Faisal.
Thank you, Amira. Well, I don't think Netflix can fix anything. Actually, at the contrary, I do think that it could be even a bit dangerous to think that the problems we have with racism, the image of Arabs and Muslims, is only related to ignorance and the fact that we don't have all these experiences, etc., that are shown in a very positive way. I do think that this is a balance of power in a very more structural way. Like geopolitically, this is exactly what I was trying to show. Actually, I do think that a colonial and imperialist project abroad will always shape the way and the balanced power that we have internally in a country. So Arabs and Muslims, and this is one of the problem, are countries that are being invaded, that are very weak, except of course of the Gulf, but the Gulf is now allying with all the political imperialist everything, so it's not an issue. But I mean, the fact that all these countries are really weak, they're not defending the diaspora outside and even the descendant of immigrants. So I think there's a link between the two. And I don't think just having a better knowledge and view of all of that will make a big difference, personally.
You have a microphone there.
Fix things. I'm going to take it more broadly, but I'll say this with regard to like Netflix. I'm heartened to see a greater degree of diversity of representation on, television, legacy media, so forth and so on. I will say this though, I view these Netflix programs from the vantage point of what some scholars classify or define as racial capitalism, that it's specific. Specific representations of Arab and Muslim identity will be chosen to be elevated and then disseminated to the masses. Specifically representations of Arab and Muslim identity that are palatable to white audiences. I'm not a big fan of the show Rami because I think that his representation is one that is shaped and fashioned largely for a suburban, white, assimilated American experience. I don't think Arabs and Muslims are the base audience of that show specifically. But again, I think that Hollywood and their proxies function to center shows that are going to resonate with the majority. The majority in the United States specifically are a white audience. I will say this though, kind of taking the question more broadly, that social media has been transformative in ways. Obviously, there's a lot of perils associated with social media. But the fact that you have, kind of journalistic entrepreneurs who are building large followings on spaces like Twitter and Instagram, essentially functioning as contemporary modern public intellectuals in many respects, addressing issues that the legacy media won't touch. Yesterday there was a young Palestinian child killed by the name of Dan Suleiman. You're not going to find his name anywhere on ABC, the BBC, the CBC, so on and so forth. But if people like Sean King and Rana Ayoub with massive followings can use those platforms to raise his name and discuss a story, that can be really impactful. And then obviously, with what's happening in Iran, so that's been heavy on my mind for these last several weeks. Especially in the United States, where it's very corporate media monster, are always pushing specific agendas that sort of fit the American imperial objective. On social media, you can have individuals with large followings, again, tell stories in authentic ways, but also individuals on the ground. Women in Iran tell their stories in very authentic ways when their internet's not being blacked out by the government. So I know that's taking the question very broadly, but that's what I'll say to that.
I think if we all agree that pop culture is part of the problem and has been part of the problem, then it's undeniable that it has to be part of the solution, or it can be part of the solution. I don't think it's the panacea, but I think it's important what's happening there. One of the first things I remember reading, my experience, I'll discuss sort of personal, way he personally came to do this kind of work is like so similar to my own background. And I think we came of age around the same time. And I remember like one of the first things I read, I think it was out of the US, it was something put out by like the Arab Arab American Anti-Discrimination League, was this kind of historical project into Arab Americans who were part of American pop culture, but were unknown, were invisible, because Arab Americans had been this sort of invisible minority. And 9/11, they suddenly became this very visible minority. And learning that, like, Casey Kasem was an Arab American, like other people, and I'm not even Arab, but as like a Muslim Canadian, as a kid, those things, matter. They mattered. I somehow related to that. And so, like, just at that visceral level, I understand that pop culture matters. Nowadays, I've never watched the Rodney Show. I've started watching Mo, and I don't like it that much, but I'm mostly watching these things to understand how Hollywood is rehabilitating itself, how the American public, the Canadian public is being fed a kind of sanitized, diversity positive, EEI positive, counter Islamophobia, but very much consistent with a sort of liberal agenda. And I think it's important to know that, because that's now part of not necessarily the enemy, but it's part of the landscape in which the work that we're all concerned about doing must operate. And it doesn't make the problems go away, but it certainly changes them and introduces nuances that we need to be familiar with.
Thank you so much. So I see a couple questions already. So we'll start with the Shereen and then. Thank you. Thank you to the audience. This all-star panel. I think Khaled and Faisal, you know you are an inspiration to many areas in Canada. I'm so happy to have you here. Thank you. Khaled, mentioning the 7-year-old Palestinian boy that was killed, being willing to share his spoken word about Marshall's people across the globe. My question is for Houda. Houda, my name is Shereen Salti. We met previously in my capacity as Executive Director of the Canadian Arab Institute. I thanked you for including my ancestry in your book, Dr. Fahim Salti, my uncle, the first president of the Canadian Arab Federation in 1967. Very nice seeing you here, and thank you for your bold analysis when examining Arab history in Canada and the centering of Palestinian rights in that analysis. My question is regarding the challenges you faced conducting your research. Perhaps if you can share limitations and the research priorities needed to move forward on Arab literature in Canada. You examined a century of Arab migration history in Canada, but what should be next? And what should researchers be prioritizing moving forward? Shukran, and my heart goes to Tunisians in solidarity with Palestinians across the globe every day. Thank you.
Okay, so that question was for you, Professor Houda. Can you hear us? Okay,
Yeah,
so
but I didn't hear the question. I heard few words. I'm really sorry. I'm not here.
I will repeat it. So Shireen Salti, who you actually featured her uncle in your book, first of all, thanks you very much for that incredible work that you've done, and is asking a very sort of deep question around what are the challenges that you face doing that type of research, and what type of supports do you think are required to continue that type of exercise?
Well, thank you very much. I don't think it was a very difficult research to do. Actually, I went to like very new archives, like like the National Archives of Canada. It was quite accessible, except few files that were very political about the 70s that were all encrypted or they didn't accept to reveal them. And mainly about some terrorist actually question. There was a false leak in the Globe and Mail in the 1970 something, where they were saying that during the Olympics, some Arabs in Canada were planning on doing a terrorist attack for the Olympics, and they were surveilling them. And it was like a big deal and big leak. And of course, nothing happened around that. So it seems that it was a false information that was leaked for like vilifying these organizations and their struggle for Palestine. So this was like, those were the things where I couldn't find information about if the Canadian government have got some kind of link to this. But except of that, people of the community as descendant like you and others were very, very happy that someone was doing the research on their history. And unfortunately, I don't feel there is so much interest in the history of many minorities in Canada, even though it's starting, but some of them are really discreet and less considered as less interesting. So this is one of the things I was thinking. And I think the fact that this history and this memory is not really preserved by the other organization today, that people don't know that there was this huge struggle, that there was solidarity with other movements. And I think this is also important, that there was support for Indigenous and Black struggles. And all of this would be really interesting and important actually for our struggles today to remember. So I think the ones who are still alive would be very important to continue to listen to and to invite to talk about this history. So, and well, that's it.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Houda. The question now to Professor Navid.
So I have a couple of questions. So first, I'll just say all the questions. So first, Dr. Baba, I remember with the Toronto 18 case, there was 2 informants and there's like massive sort of incentive structures in place to kind of build a case against these individuals. And I was following the Natal and Karoti case as well. I know that there was a CSIS or a RCMP informant involved. I'm just wondering, were these sort of incentive structures in place as well in terms of, I guess, career advancement or whatever, as well as the other one that you mentioned that I'm not familiar with? I think it's the Ahmed case that's more recent. So that's for Dr. Baba. For Dr. Beydoun, I've used your work a lot over the last little while. So I'm curious on your thoughts. So specifically in terms of how you talk about structural and private Islamophobia and dialectic Islamophobia and that relationship between them. When I'm looking at the Canadian context kind of earlier on in my work, I've always kind of seen structural Islamophobia kind of informing the private sphere. But more recently, I kind of see it more as sort of a kind of going both ways, like a symbiotic sort of relationship where they kind of feed off of one another. And then looking at other contexts, I've looked at Myanmar as well. And over there, I really do kind of see it as a top-down, bottom-up process as well, where the private, or sorry, the sort of the structural kind of Islamophobia is really kind of creating a space for the private to fester, and then it shoots right back up to the structural sphere. So I'm wondering, do you see this kind of as a sort of a symbiotic relationship, or can it, or kind of more top down, bottom up, or does it kind of change over time and so on? And lastly, just for Dr. Houda, my name is it's Navid Bakali. We shared supervisors, Dr. Aziz Chaudhry, over the years. So I was really excited to meet you in person, but it didn't happen. But I just want to convey my salutations to you, and hopefully we will have a chance to meet in person one day. That's all.
Thanks for the question. I think what you're asking is, you're asking about the Toronto 18 trial. So the Toronto 18 trial was a prosecution launched in 2006. In fact, I remember the day because I was appearing in the Supreme Court of Canada that day on behalf of the National Council of Canadian Muslims and a whole bunch of other interveners that had, as well as a huge community convoy of activists who had traveled to Ottawa for the hearing in what was known as the secret trial 5. There's 5 Muslim Arab men who'd been detained without charge indefinitely on suspicion of that they posed a risk to the security of Canada under an immigration law mechanism. And by what a coincidence that the same day that the Supreme Court of Canada is hearing this very important case, the first time ever that a Canadian Muslim organization was appearing at the Supreme Court of Canada ever in the history of the court to make submissions in this case, the first time the court was considering the war on terror in any kind of substantial way, is the morning that the police decide to arrest 17 or 18 young Muslim men in the GTA in the Toronto area on suspicion of terrorism. So that pattern repeated itself over the years, where terrorism charges and trials have been more sort of performance art on the part of the security agencies than the removal of real threats. And so to the extent that you're asking, what is a comparison between Nuttall in 2016 and the Toronto 18 a decade earlier, well, I think one major difference is the passage of time. I'm not a criminal lawyer and I don't study criminal doctrine. So, and I'm still working my way through entrapment and its kind of broader implications. But from speaking to criminal lawyers, I've heard the opinion expressed, this isn't my opinion, but I've definitely heard it commonly expressed that the Toronto 18, if they'd had the benefit of time, they quite likely would have evaded conviction. In other words, there are people who view that case as a case of entrapment as well. I'll leave it at that. Thank you for the question.
Speaking to both, right? Speaking into both microphones. Yeah, with regard to your question as to whether dialectical Islamophobia, functions both ways, I would say this. I would say that the law is the sort, given that the law has a lot of force, obviously, both in terms of its technical legal impact, but also as a broader communicating of itself, right? It shapes narratives, it endorses specific narratives in society. Then the post 9/11 context, the various laws that were enacted by the legislature in the United States, by the executive, those were more top down in the sense that they were endorsing and then exacerbating attitudes that individuals on the ground had of Muslims, but also shaping new ideas, right? This idea that Muslim identity was tied to terrorism, like discussed, was there was a consciousness around that pre 9/11, but it was very much made more cogent and consolidated in the post 9/11 context as a consequence of law, right? Patriot Act, NSEERS, formation of DHS, counter-radicalization policing, and so forth and so on. But, given that we're living in a war on terror, which has protracted to 2 decades, 21 years, it's become more symbiotic, right? Because there are moments in which, popular or private Islamophobia declines or diminishes. But then you have specific, populists and political charlatans like Trump, Marine Le Pen in France, the communist regime in China. You mentioned Myanmar. They look to sort of meet the Islamophobic demands of the polity, right? So individuals or elements on the ground, segments of society that are calling for more draconian policies to police Muslims. There was an article written in 2005 by a Yale law professor called Munir Ahmed, called "A Rage Shared by Law," where he talks about how the polity was asking for, acting in vengeance in ways in which the state was not meeting its benchmark of punishing and prosecuting Muslims. So when elements or segments of the state, whether it be private actors or ambitious political parties like the Tea Party in the United States, are pushing a more Islamophobic policy, that leads to sometimes the election of politicians and full scale regimes that are willing to enact policy rising from the bottom up. But I see it more as oftentimes a top driven dialectic than a bottom driven, but that doesn't exclude the possibility from it coming from the grassroots.
Okay, so I've been told that we can go a little bit extra because this discussion is really very, very rich. So we'll take a couple more questions if we have any more out there in the audience. Go ahead, Professor Yasmin. Sure, I'll bring you this mic too.
Thanks so much for a very rich panel. The question I have for you is that, if we think of the fact that it's actually been more than 20 years since 9/11, we have seen some shifts. So for example, around the Palestinian issue, I think there's, really a much broader, forms of social movement organizing on university campuses. Some of the discussions in the mainstream media are arguably, different in terms of op-eds. You have the BDS movement and so on. And even voices from within the US Congress that we didn't have, in the immediate post 9/11 period. So you have that going on. Arguably also university campuses have been places where there's been more attention to studying Islam. And I'm picking up also on your comment that there's sort of this burgeoning legal profession, an area around critical race theory where there's also attention to anti-Arab racism, anti-Muslim racism. So that's part of the lexicon. So the question I have for you is, whether you have any, hope, kind of given those trends that we might identify. Yes. Yeah, I want to end on a happy note here. Oh yeah, well, we can still ask her question. I think she's going to bring us down again, but.
Okay, well, I guess I'll interpret that question as being, are things getting better or are things getting worse? And I think that the truth is both is happening. I think one of the things that's getting worse while things are getting better is, yes, I think the culture around advocating for Palestine has improved. As somebody who has been on university campuses for more than 20 years, in some ways it's improved, but then in other ways it's gotten worse. And I think what's happened is the quality of expressive freedom, broadly speaking, has diminished. And ironically, I think that is as a result of the ascendancy of social media and the ability to engage in expressive activity that we've seen over the last decade. And that's kind of a big issue that is touched on in lots of different areas, but I think it's had a particular impact on the issues that we're discussing. in that, you know, so-called cancel culture, the risk of being attacked, trolled, the chill on, so we there, you know, I find in discussions with students, my students these days, is I look at the improvements. I look at how much easier it must be. I think it must be to be a student today advocating for Palestine, for example. And yet I talk to my students and all I hear is fear of expressing themselves. And so that chill has now become internalized. It's becoming part of our culture. There's a generational shift in the willingness of people to express themselves openly, whether they're to express, and I should say to express controversial political opinions openly. I think there's been an embrace of expressing identity openly. So it's a lot more comfortable to be a person who wears hijab, for example, but it's a lot less comfortable, I would argue, to be a person who holds a dissident opinion. So how we manage with that, I think, is the challenge going forward.
Yeah, I'd echo those sentiments in the sense that I think it's complicated, right? On one end, there's been a lot of progress with regard specifically to, you know, Islamophobia, for instance, right? In the United States, it's very much escalated and emerged as a focal social and racial justice issue. You have, you know, mainstream organizations like the ACLU and, you know, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International that talk about Islamophobia, you know, among the sort of like, you know, first tier civil and human rights concerns that they address. Universities and colleges, like you've mentioned, wanting to hire individuals who are experts in those fields and spheres. So on that front, I think that there's been, you know, I want to end on a hopeful note, but at least surface progress. But I would say there's been regress, and our issues are obviously heterogeneous in nature, but they're entangled. I would say there's regress with regard specifically to Palestine. And I'll share an experience. I was recently called for a job interview at a law school in the United States. I won't mention which one. I don't do research on Palestine. I'm an activist on Palestine. I publish and use my social media platforms to address what's happening in Palestine very often. But the sad reality is that, you know, these Orientalist and Islamophobic conflations that all of us were talking about are still very much adopted and institutionalized within the highest echelons of power, whether academic, political, or media in the United States, that if you're somebody who's perceived to be in any way associated with Palestine, that's a red line for these institutions. They're not going to hire you, right? And specifically, if you're somebody who does Palestinian research and work, you're typically a no-go for these spaces. So I think there's been regress on that front, and specifically regress with what Professor Baba said, that even though you have, you know, again, this DEI cosmetic embrace of racial and religious diversity being celebrated by institutions, I think a lot of that's performative. And I think that students, and specifically in the institutions in which they matriculate, are oftentimes scared to, you know, get to the marrow of many of these issues that are provocative and that are timely in nature, specifically Palestine. I'm sorry for ending on a sad note, but it's happy sad though, it's both.
Can I say something? Can you hear me? Can I answer? Yeah. So, well, I agree with both of you totally. I think there is hope on one hand, and other regression, and it's the backlash. At the same time, it's because we're getting stronger that we're getting so much attacked. And I think Palestine and Islamophobia, but maybe it's also because I'm in France now, and Islamophobia is a huge deal in France, and it's not something that's getting better. I don't know. In some ways, in some leftist parties, there is some kind of thinking around Islamophobia. And I think in Quebec, it's also not really good in the French context, in the Francophone context. So there is also this difference that might make them be a bit different. But still, I agree with the fact that social movements are stronger. And I do think that the resistance is stronger. I do think that the youth are very aware. And it's true for many things in politics. And I do have hope, actually, that all those media forces, lobbying, everything that's really attacking any progressive movement these days, at one point we will end up ignoring them, and the resistance will continue. Yes, it's difficult to talk about Islamophobia or to talk about Palestine, and I agree that those are the two red lines, and I think I'm a good example of that, not having a permanent position in university working on those topics. But still, I do think that people don't care and continue fighting. And yes, they are scared, but there is also a real energy and something happening around these issues on many levels. So I think we can have hope, and we have to always see social movement and something really long in history. So it's normal that we have some ups and downs, but I think we can continue fighting on those fronts.